Sometimes miracles happen in the most ordinary places. For James Martinez and his 10-year-old son Tommy, it happened at Friendly's gas station on an empty tank and a prayer. They didn't know that counting pennies for gas that morning would lead to crossing paths with Michael Jordan. They couldn't have guessed that a worn-out basketball and a faded Bulls jersey, a last gift from Tommy's late mother, would change their lives forever. But then again, the biggest moments often come when you're running on empty, just trying to make it through another day. The gas gauge needle trembled below E as James Martinez guided his old Honda Civic into the Friendly's gas station. The orange warning light had been glowing for 2 days now, like a tiny sun of worry on his dashboard. He glanced at the crumpled $5 bill and handful of ones in his cup holder. The last of his money until payday. Still 3 days away. "It'll have to be enough," he whispered to himself, a habit he'd picked up since Maria passed away 2 years ago. The thought of his late wife sent a familiar ache through his chest. She would have known how to make this work, somehow. Maria had always been the one who could stretch $1 until it cried for mercy. "Dad, can I practice while you get gas?" Tommy's voice came from the back seat, where his 10-year-old son clutched a basketball that had seen better days. The leather was worn smooth in spots, and the grip lines were almost completely gone. But Tommy treated it like it was made of gold. James caught his son's eye in the rearview mirror and managed to smile. "Sure, buddy. Just stay where I can see you, okay? And watch out for cars." As Tommy scrambled out of the car, James noticed how his son's sneakers were starting to show holes near the toes. Another expense they couldn't afford right now. His shoulders slumped as he pushed open his door, the familiar squeak of old hinges joining the symphony of financial worry playing in his head. The night shift at the school where he worked as a janitor had been particularly rough. Some kids had thought it would be funny to pour glue all over the gym floor. It had taken him 3 extra hours to clean up, which meant he'd only gotten 4 hours of sleep before his morning warehouse shift. His back ached from lifting boxes, and his eyes felt like they were full of sand. The numbers on the gas pump seemed to mock him as he inserted his card, praying it wouldn't be declined. $4.29 per gallon. He did the math quickly in his head. Something Maria had always teased him about. How he could calculate gas prices faster than their old calculator. His $15 would get him just over 3 gallons. Maybe enough to last until payday, if he coasted downhill whenever possible and took the shorter route to work. While the pump hummed, James watched Tommy dribbling his basketball on the small patch of concrete near the air pump. His son's form was perfect, elbow tucked, follow-through clean, just like they'd practiced hundreds of times in their apartment parking lot. A memory flashed through his mind. Maria, sitting in her favorite lawn chair, wrapped in a blanket even in the summer heat, cheering as Tommy made shot after shot. "You've got a future NBA star there," she'd said, her voice weak but her smile strong. That was just 3 months before. James shook his head, forcing the memory away. The pump clicked off at $15.03. He winced at the 3 cents over but figured the station wouldn't come after him for it. As he replaced the nozzle, his stomach growled, reminding him that he'd skipped breakfast to save the last 2 slices of bread for Tommy's lunch. The morning sun was getting stronger now, promising another hot day. James checked his watch. 7:15 a.m. He had just enough time to drop Tommy at school before heading to the warehouse. Then tonight, he'd be back at the school, pushing his mop past Tommy's classroom, sometimes finding homework papers with his son's name on them crumpled in the trash. The last one he'd smoothed out had a D+ written in red at the top. "Tommy!" he called out. "Time to go, buddy." His son caught the ball mid-dribble and jogged over, his face flushed with exercise and happiness. It was the most alive he looked these days. Ever since Maria died, Tommy had grown quieter, except when he was playing basketball. Then, he became the chattering, energetic kid he used to be. "Dad, did you see? I made 5 in a row." Just like Michael Jordan, Tommy's eyes sparkled as he climbed back into the car. James swallowed hard. Last week, Tommy had asked for a Michael Jordan poster for his bedroom. It only cost $12.99, but that might as well have been $1,000 right now. "That's great, son. Maybe this weekend we can practice some more." As he turned the key in the ignition, the car coughed twice before starting. Another problem he couldn't afford to fix. The radio crackled to life, and James quickly turned it down when he heard the commercial for the new Air Jordans that Tommy had been talking about non-stop. They pulled out of the gas station, the Honda's engine protesting slightly. In the back seat, Tommy was already lost in his own world, spinning his basketball on one finger like he'd been practicing all month. James watched him in the rear-view mirror, his heart swelling with love and breaking with worry all at once. The morning traffic was building up on Mason Street. As they waited at a red light, James noticed a sign in a store window, "Help Wanted, part-time." He already worked from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. at the warehouse, then 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. as a janitor. Maybe he could find something for the hours in between. A few more dollars might mean being able to buy Tommy those new sneakers. Or maybe even the light turned green, and James pushed the thought away. He was already running on empty, both his gas tank and himself. But as he heard the soft thump of Tommy's basketball against the back seat floor, he made a silent promise to his son, to Maria, to himself. Somehow, some way, he would find a way to keep Tommy's dreams alive, even if it meant running on fumes to do it. The school parking lot was already filling up when James pulled into the drop-off lane. Tommy's basketball made a soft thud as it rolled under the seat when they stopped. "Have a good day at school, buddy," James said, turning to face his son. "Remember, Mrs. Peterson said she'd help you with math during lunch if you need it." Tommy's face fell slightly at the mention of math. "Do I have to? I was going to practice my jump shot at recess." James felt a familiar tug in his chest. 20 years ago, he'd been just like Tommy. A kid who lived and breathed basketball, who'd rather shoot hoops than solve equations. His old high school trophy, now wrapped in newspaper and stuffed in their apartment's tiny storage closet, was proof of that passion. "Tell you what," James said, trying to sound upbeat. "If you spend lunch with Mrs. Peterson today, we can practice twice as long this weekend. Deal?" Tommy considered this, his fingers absently tracing the worn spots on his backpack. "Promise?" "Promise." James held out his pinky, their special way of sealing important deals since Tommy was 5. His son's smaller finger wrapped around his, and for a moment, James saw Maria in Tommy's smile. As Tommy climbed out of the car, James noticed his son's shirt was getting too small. The sleeves barely reached his wrists. Another item for the growing list of things they needed but couldn't afford. He watched Tommy join the stream of students heading into Lincoln Elementary, his dark hair and too small shirt disappearing into the crowd. 20 minutes later, James pulled into the warehouse parking lot, his mind drifting back to his own school days. The memory rose up clear and sharp. Championship game, senior year, scouts from State University in the stands. He'd scored 32 points that night. Could still hear Coach Martinez, no relation, but everyone had joked about it, shouting, "That's my boy! That's my star!" The scholarship offer had come 2 days later. Full ride, starting position practically guaranteed. But then his mom got sick, and with his dad long gone, there was no one else to help. He'd chosen family over basketball, just Like his son was now choosing basketball over grades to cope with losing his mom. History repeating itself, James muttered as he punched in for his shift. The warehouse was already humming with activity, forklifts beeping as they moved pallets of merchandise. "Martinez!" his supervisor, Bob, called out. "Need you on loading." "Dock 3 today." Johnson called in sick. James nodded, already feeling his back protest at the thought of 8 hours of heavy lifting. As he made his way to the dock, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen showed Lincoln Elementary's number, and his heart sank. "Mr. Martinez?" Mrs. Anderson's voice was gentle but firm. "Do you have a moment to talk about Tommy?" James moved to a quieter corner of the warehouse. "Is everything okay? I'm concerned about his latest math test. He scored a DD, and when I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said basketball players don't need math." The words hit James like a physical blow. He'd said almost the exact same thing to his mom. Once, before she got sick, before reality had taught him how wrong he was. "There's more," Mrs. Anderson continued. "He's been spending recesses alone, just shooting baskets. The other kids try to include him, but he says he needs to practice. Mr. Martinez, I know tomorrow is the 2-year anniversary of... Well, I just wanted you to know we're here to help." James leaned against the cold metal wall, closing his eyes. He hadn't realized Tommy knew what tomorrow's date was. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. I'll talk to him tonight." After hanging up, James stared at his phone's background picture. Tommy and Maria at his 9th birthday party, both grinning with cake frosting on their noses. That had been just 3 months before the diagnosis, before their world had shattered into pieces he was still trying to pick up. "Martinez! Those boxes ain't gonna move themselves!" Bob's voice snapped him back to reality. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of heavy lifting and worry. By the time he clocked out at 4 p.m., his back was screaming and his hands were raw. He had exactly 45 minutes to pick up Tommy from the after-school program before heading to his janitorial job. The apartment parking lot was empty when they got home, which meant Tommy could practice for a bit while James changed into his custodian uniform. As he rushed to get ready, he could hear the rhythmic bounce of the basketball outside their second-floor window. Thump, thump, thump. Each bounce seemed to echo the words running through his head. Not enough. Not enough. Not enough. James paused in front of the mirror, straightening his name tag. Dark circles under his eyes made him look older than 35. His own father had disappeared when James was Tommy's age, leaving nothing but a stack of unpaid bills and a broken family. "I won't do that to him," James whispered to his reflection. "I won't run away, no matter how hard it gets." The sound of breaking glass shattered the evening quiet, followed by Tommy's panicked, "Dad!" James raced down the apartment stairs, his heart in his throat. He found Tommy standing frozen, staring at the broken window of Mr. Garcia's car. The basketball rolled innocently nearby. "I'm sorry," Tommy whispered, tears starting to roll down his cheeks. "I was trying to practice my three-pointer like Michael Jordan, but the ball slipped." Mr. Garcia, their elderly neighbor, was already walking toward them, his face dark with anger. James stepped in front of Tommy, mentally calculating how many extra shifts it would take to pay for a new car window. They were already behind on rent, and the electricity bill was due next week. "Mr. Garcia, I'm so sorry. I'll pay for everything. I promise." The old man's expression softened slightly as he looked at Tommy's tear-streaked face. "The boy needs a proper court to practice on, James. The parking lot is no place for basketball." "I know," James said quietly. "I know." Later that night, after his janitor shift, James sat on the edge of Tommy's bed, watching his son sleep. The basketball lay in the corner, a silent reminder of everything he couldn't provide. Tommy's math homework sat unfinished on his desk, next to a crumpled paper with basketball plays drawn all over it. James reached into his pocket and pulled out the small collection of coins he'd been saving in the car's ashtray. In the dim light from the window, he counted them carefully. $4.87. Not even enough for a proper breakfast, let alone a new car window or basketball court fees. Tomorrow was the anniversary of Maria's death, and for the first time, James allowed himself to cry silently in the darkness of his son's room. "I don't know how to do this without you," he whispered to the empty air. "He needs more than I can give him." Outside, the gas station's bright lights glowed in the distance, reminding him that tomorrow was another day of running on empty, in more ways than one. The next morning arrived too quickly, heavy with memories and unshed tears. James stared at his phone's calendar, the date seeming to pulse on the screen. May 15th. 2 years without Maria. "Tommy! Time for school!" he called out, his voice rougher than usual. They'd have to stop for gas again. The needle was somehow already below empty, defying what little he'd put in yesterday. Tommy emerged from his room wearing his favorite Chicago Bulls t-shirt, the one Maria had given him for Christmas 2 years ago. It was faded now, but Tommy refused to wear anything else on this day. He clutched his basketball like a shield. "Can I bring it today?" Tommy asked quietly. "Please. Mom always liked watching me play." James nodded, not trusting his voice. Maria had spent countless hours sitting on their apartment balcony, wrapped in blankets even in the warmest weather, cheering Tommy's every shot. Even when the chemo had taken her hair and her strength, she'd still found the energy to clap. The drive to Friendly's gas station was silent, both lost in their own memories. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pavement as James pulled up to pump number 4. Maria's lucky number. He had exactly $7 left, scraped together from checking under the car seats. "I'm going to practice over there," Tommy said, pointing to a clear spot near the air pump, the same place he'd played yesterday. James watched him go, remembering how Maria used to say that Tommy was most himself when he was playing basketball. The station was unusually busy for this early hour. James inserted his card, praying it wouldn't be declined, when a sleek black SUV pulled into the station. The vehicle moved with quiet power, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. Something about it drew everyone's attention, like a shark gliding into a quiet pond. Tommy's basketball chose that moment to get away from him, rolling under the SUV just as it came to a stop. James started forward, but Tommy was faster, dropping to his knees to peer under the vehicle. "Sorry," Tommy called out. "My ball just—" The SUV's door opened, and a shadow fell across the pavement. A very tall shadow. James froze, his hand still on the gas pump as a familiar figure stepped out. Even if you'd never watched basketball, you'd know who this was. The height, the presence, the way everyone at the gas station suddenly went silent. Michael Jordan himself bent down, reaching under his vehicle to retrieve Tommy's worn basketball. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers finding the smooth spots where the grip had worn away from countless hours of practice. "This is a well-loved ball," Jordan said, his voice carrying in the morning quiet. He looked at Tommy, who stood, rooted to the spot, mouth open in shock. "You must play a lot." Tommy nodded, seemingly unable to speak. His Bulls t-shirt suddenly seemed to glow with meaning. Maria's last Christmas gift connecting past and present in an impossible moment. "Every day," James found himself saying, stepping away from the pump. He practices every day. Jordan's gaze shifted to James, taking in his worn work clothes, the old Honda with its empty gas tank, the way he stood protectively near his son. Something flickered in the basketball legend's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of a familiar kind of dedication. Tommy finally found his voice. You're Michael Jordan," he whispered. "My mom gave me your jersey. She said you never gave up, even when things were hard." James felt his throat tighten. Maria had told Tommy that story from her hospital bed, using Jordan's famous flu game as a way to explain why she had to keep fighting, keep trying, even when the treatments made her sick. Jordan spun the ball on his finger, the same trick Tommy had been practicing for months, then handed it back. "Your mom sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Tommy said softly, accepting the ball. Then, with the pure courage of childhood, he added, "She died 2 years ago today, but she taught me your fadeaway shot before she got sick." The morning sun seemed to pause in its climb as Jordan looked from Tommy to James, taking in the whole story without needing to hear it. The single dad working multiple jobs, the boy finding solace in basketball, the worn ball that represented both escape and hope. "Show me," Jordan said simply, gesturing to the small clear area where Tommy had been practicing. James watched as his son, wearing his mother's last gift, began to play basketball with his hero in a gas station parking lot. Tommy's form was perfect. Elbow tucked, follow-through clean, just as Maria had taught him. Each shot seemed to pierce the morning air with possibility. Other customers had stopped pumping gas. Phones had appeared to record the moment, but James barely noticed. He was seeing his son smile. Really smile. For the first time in 2 years. And somehow, on this hardest of days, Maria felt closer than ever. Jordan said something quietly to Tommy that made him laugh, and the sound echoed across the parking lot like music. James looked down at his phone, at the picture of Maria grinning with cake frosting on her nose, and whispered, "Are you seeing this, honey? Are you seeing our boy?" The gas pump clicked off behind him, pulling him back to reality. $7 worth of gas. Not enough to last long, but maybe, just maybe, enough for this moment to stretch out a little longer. In the growing morning light, as his son played basketball with Michael Jordan in a gas station parking lot, James realized that sometimes running on empty could lead you exactly where you needed to be. The morning sun climbed higher as Tommy demonstrated his fadeaway shot again. Michael Jordan stood with his arms crossed, studying every detail of the boy's form. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, their phones recording this unexpected moment at Friendly's gas station. "Your base is solid," Jordan said, adjusting Tommy's elbow slightly. "But try keeping your eyes locked on that back corner of the backboard. That's your target, no matter what." Tommy nodded eagerly, his face glowing with concentration. He'd turn the station's trash can into a makeshift basket, and his next shot went in with a satisfying swoosh. "Mom always said to imagine the rim was giving me a high five," Tommy said, then quickly glanced at his father, worried he'd said too much about Maria on this difficult day. But Jordan just smiled, a warm, understanding expression that made him seem less like a legend and more like a friend. "Your mom knew what she was talking about. That's exactly the kind of thing my father used to say." James checked his watch and felt his heart sink. They were already late for school, and he'd miss the start of his warehouse shift. But before he could say anything, Jordan turned to him. "I hope you don't mind if we borrow a few more minutes of your morning," he said. It wasn't really a question. "Your son has something special here." The words echoed in James's mind, His old high school coach had said the same thing, right before offering to help him get that college scholarship. Before real life had stepped in and changed everything. "Sure," James heard himself say. A few more minutes. Jordan pulled another basketball from his SUV, a brand new one with perfect grip. He handed it to Tommy, whose eyes went wide at the feel of it. "Now, show me that crossover of yours. But this time, imagine you're not just playing for yourself. You're playing for your mom." Tommy's expression changed, becoming focused in a way James hadn't seen since Maria was alive. The boy began to dribble, the new ball bouncing crisp and clean against the pavement. His crossover was quick, practiced from countless hours in the apartment parking lot. "There it is," Jordan said approvingly. "But basketball isn't just about the moves, is it? It's about heart, about family." He glanced at James. "About never giving up, even when the game gets tough." A younger boy from the crowd of onlookers had edged closer, clutching his own basketball. Tommy noticed him and, without prompting, waved. "Him over. Want to play?" Tommy asked, surprising James with his openness. These days, Tommy usually avoided other kids, preferring to practice alone. The boy, who couldn't have been more than 8, nodded enthusiastically. Soon, Jordan was coaching both boys, teaching them a simple pick-and-roll play. Other children gradually joined in, and before long, the gas station had transformed into an impromptu basketball clinic. James watched in amazement as his son laughed and played with the other kids, something he hadn't done in months. Tommy was helping the younger ones with their form, showing the same patience Maria had always shown with him. "He's got coaching instincts," Jordan said quietly, stepping back to stand beside James. "That's rare in someone so young. Usually, kids his age just want to show off their own skills. He gets that from his mother," James replied, his voice rough with emotion. "She was a teacher. Elementary school, just like the one he goes to now." Jordan nodded thoughtfully, watching as Tommy demonstrated a proper shooting stance to a small girl in pink sneakers. "Tell me about her," he said simply. And somehow, standing in a gas station parking lot next to the greatest basketball player of all time, James found himself talking about Maria, about how she'd made every parent-teacher conference feel like a celebration, how she'd kept teaching until the cancer made it impossible, how she'd turned their tiny apartment balcony into a classroom, teaching Tommy fractions using his basketball practice shots. 75% from the free throw line, James remembered, smiling despite the ache in his chest. That's how. She taught him decimals and percentages. She said if he could understand his shooting stats, he could understand anything. "Smart woman," Jordan said. He was quiet for a moment, watching the kids play. "You know, I lost my father too soon. He never got to see most of my championships, but everything I did on the court, I did to honor him." James thought about his own father, who'd walked away without a backward glance, about how he'd promised himself he'd never do that to Tommy, no matter how hard things got. "Sometimes," Jordan continued, "the biggest assists in life don't happen on the court. They happen in moments like this." He gestured to where Tommy was now organizing the other kids into teams, his natural leadership emerging like a flower after a long winter. A horn honked in the distance, and James suddenly remembered the real world, his warehouse job, Tommy's school, all the responsibilities waiting for them. But before he could call Tommy over, Jordan held up a hand. "Would you mind if I had a word with you?" he asked. "In private?" James nodded, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't explain. He called out to Tommy, "5 more minutes, buddy. Then we really have to go." Tommy gave him a thumbs up, too engaged in his impromptu coaching session to notice the serious look that had crossed Jordan's face. As they walked toward the SUV, James could hear his son's voice carrying across the parking lot. "Remember what?" My mom said. "Imagine the rim is giving you a high five." The morning light caught the tears in James's eyes, turning them into tiny prisms. Sometimes the hardest days brought the most unexpected gifts. And sometimes those gifts came with a lesson that went far beyond basketball. Jordan opened his SUV door and reached inside. "There's something I want to discuss with you," he said, pulling out an envelope. "About your son's future." James stood there, his empty gas tank forgotten, as the morning sun painted the gas station in shades of gold. In that moment, he understood that this wasn't just about basketball. It was about second chances, about honoring the past while building a future. It was about running on empty until someone came along to help fill your tank. The envelope in Jordan's hands looked ordinary enough, plain white, unmarked. But something about the way he held it made James's heart race. Behind them, the sound of bouncing basketballs and children's laughter created a backdrop to this surreal moment. "Let's sit," Jordan said, gesturing to a bench near the gas station's mini-mart. It was the kind of bench where people normally waited for their cars to be serviced. But now, it felt like the most important seat in the world. James sank down, suddenly, aware of how his work uniform was already wrinkled, how his hands were calloused from lifting boxes and pushing mops. Next to Jordan's tailored suit, he felt every inch the struggling father he was. "Your son," Jordan began, still holding the envelope, "reminds me of myself at that age. But more than that, he reminds me of my own father." James looked up, surprised. Everyone knew about Michael Jordan's legendary career, but few talked about James Jordan Sr., whose tragic death had led to his son's first retirement from basketball. "My father believed in me before anyone else did," Jordan continued. "He worked. 2 jobs, too. Used to come home exhausted but would still find the energy to help me practice." Sound familiar? James nodded, watching Tommy in the distance as he taught a younger kid how to properly follow through on a shot. The morning sun caught the faded letters on his Bulls shirt, making them shine like new. "But here's what I learned," Jordan said, his voice taking on a tone that made James think of Maria's last days, when she'd shared her most important wisdom. "Sometimes the biggest assist doesn't come from the person you expect. Sometimes it comes from a stranger who sees something worth investing in." He turned the envelope over in his hands. "I've been watching Tommy for the past hour. He's got talent, sure, but more than that, he's got something you can't teach. He's got heart. The way he helps those younger kids, the way he talks about his mother." Jordan paused. "That's not something you can practice into existence." Maria always said he had an old soul, James found himself saying. Even before she got sick, she'd tell me he was born understanding things most kids had to learn. Jordan nodded. "I can see that. But I also see something else. I see a kid who's carrying a lot of weight on young shoulders, and a father who's carrying even more." James felt his throat tighten. He thought about the unpaid bills at home, the broken window he couldn't afford to fix, Tommy's declining grades, the constant struggle to keep gas in the car and food on the table. "I had a dream once," James said quietly. "State University, basketball scholarship. But my mom got sick, and I had to choose." "I know," Jordan said simply. At James's surprised look, he added, "Coach Martinez. He's an old friend. Called me last night, actually. Said he saw something on social media about a kid practicing perfect form at this gas station. Said the kid's father had the same natural talent he'd seen 20 years ago." James blinked back tears. He hadn't thought about Coach Martinez in years, hadn't known his old mentor still remembered him. Your son needs his father, Jordan continued. But he also needs his father's dreams to stay alive. Kids see more than we think. When we give up on ourselves, they notice. They start giving up too. The truth of these words hit James like a physical blow. He thought about Tommy's declining grades, his isolation from friends, his intense focus on basketball not just as a sport, but as a connection to his mother's memory. "I don't know how to fix it," James admitted. "I'm trying, but it feels like running uphill with weights on." Jordan smiled. "That's exactly how my father described raising me. Said I was the best kind of burden, the kind that makes you stronger." He finally held out the envelope. "Which is why I want to help." James stared at the envelope, not reaching for it. "Mr. Jordan, I can't accept—" "James," Jordan interrupted, using his name for the first time. 20 years ago, you made a choice between family and basketball. You chose family. Now I'm telling you that you don't have to choose. Sometimes the game gives back what it takes away." The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the gas station parking lot. Tommy's voice carried over to them. "No, like this. See how your elbow stays in? That's what my mom taught me." "Your wife," Jordan said softly, "taught your son more than basketball. She taught him how to teach, how to care, how to keep going when the tank is empty. Now it's time for someone to help fill that tank." James finally reached for the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. But before he could open it, Jordan placed a hand on his arm. "There's one condition," he said. "You have to promise me something." "What's that?" "Promise me you won't give up on your own dreams while helping Tommy chase his. Promise me you'll remember that it's never too late for a comeback." James looked at his son, still teaching and playing with the other kids, still wearing Maria's last Christmas gift, like armor against grief. He thought about all the nights he'd watched Tommy practice alone, all the times he'd wished he could give him more than just encouragement and love. "I promise," he said. And for the first time in 2 years, the words felt like more than just empty hope. Jordan stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow. Good, because sometimes the biggest victories don't happen on the court. Sometimes they happen in gas station parking lots, on ordinary mornings that turn out to be anything but ordinary. He looked at the envelope in James's hands. "Don't open it yet. Wait until tomorrow. Some gifts need the right moment." As Jordan started walking back to his SUV, he turned one last time. "Oh, and James? Maria would be proud of both of you." The envelope felt warm in James's hands, like it contained not just paper, but possibility, the future perhaps, or maybe just the strength to keep believing in one. The sound of a car door closing snapped James's back to reality. He watched as Jordan's black SUV pulled away from the gas station, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. The envelope seemed to burn in his pocket as he stood up, feeling like he'd just woken from a dream. "Dad!" Tommy called out, running over with the new basketball Jordan had given him. "Did you see? I taught Kevin how to do a proper jump shot, just like Mom showed me." His face was flushed with excitement, eyes bright with a joy James hadn't seen in years. "I saw, buddy." James pulled his son close, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo mixed with morning air. "You're a natural teacher, just like her." Tommy pulled back slightly, looking up at his father. "Mr. Jordan said something about that. He said—" Tommy's voice got quieter, more serious. "He said Mom's probably watching every shot I make, and that's why I have to keep my elbow in." so she can be proud. James felt his throat tighten. He's right about that. A small crowd still lingered in the parking lot, some people typing on their phones, others talking excitedly about what they'd just witnessed. Kevin, the young boy Tommy had been teaching, stood nearby with his mother, who was wiping tears from her eyes. "Mr. Martinez," she called out, walking over. "I just wanted to say, my Kevin, he's been struggling since his father deployed overseas. This is the first time I've seen him smile in months." "Your son," she paused, composing herself. "He has a gift?" James watched as Tommy immediately went back to Kevin, showing him another basketball move. The two boys fell into an easy rhythm of practice and play, as if they'd known each other for years instead of minutes. "Sometimes the best gifts come on the hardest days," James said softly, remembering Jordan's words. His phone buzzed, a message from Bob at the warehouse. "Saw the videos online. Take the day off. Paid. Some things are more important than boxes." James stared at the message in disbelief. In 2 years, he'd never taken a day off, not even when he had the flu. The weight of the envelope in his pocket seemed to grow lighter. "Tommy," he called out, "how would you feel about skipping school today?" His son's eyes went wide. "Really? But what about Mrs. Anderson's math test?" James smiled, remembering Jordan's words about choices and priorities. "I think today we have some more important things to work on. But first, you have to make me a promise." Tommy jogged over, still clutching his new basketball. "What kind of promise?" James knelt down to his son's eye level, the way Maria always had when she was saying something important. "Promise me that starting tomorrow, you'll work as hard on your schoolwork as you do on your basketball. Because being great isn't just about what you can do on the court." Tommy's expression grew serious, reminding James so much of Maria. It made his heart ache. Like how Mom used to say, "Basketball is like life. You have to practice the boring stuff to get to the fun stuff." Exactly like that. James held out his pinky. "So, do we have a deal? You'll let Mrs. Peterson help you with math during lunch." Tommy wrapped his small pinky around his father's. "I promise." Then he added, "But Dad, can we still practice basketball too?" "Every day," James assured him. "Just like always. But maybe," he looked around the gas station parking lot at the scattered group of kids still hanging around. "Maybe we could practice with your new friends sometimes? Kevin looks like he could use a good coaching." Tommy's face lit up. "Really? I could teach them what Mom taught me?" "I think she'd love that." They spent the next hour at the gas station, Tommy organizing a small basketball clinic for the neighborhood kids who had stayed. James watched as his son moved from player to player, showing the same patience Maria had always shown with her students. Parents began arriving, drawn by texts and social media posts about Michael Jordan's surprise appearance. But they stayed for something else. The sight of their children learning and laughing together, led by a boy in a faded Bulls shirt who taught with his heart. "Your wife was a teacher?" one father asked James, watching his daughter successfully make her first basket under Tommy's guidance. "Elementary school," James nodded. "She always said every child has a gift. The trick is helping them find it. Looks like your son found his." The morning stretched into afternoon. James bought hot dogs from the gas station convenience store for all the kids, remembering Jordan's words about comebacks and second chances. The envelope stayed in his pocket, waiting for tomorrow, but its presence felt less like a wait and more like a promise. As the sun climbed higher, parents began collecting their children, each one stopping to thank Tommy and exchange phone numbers for future basketball meetups. Kevin was the last to leave, his mother mouthing a silent thank you to James over her son's head. Finally, it was just James and Tommy, standing in the now quiet gas station parking lot. The same spot where, just hours ago, they'd been running on empty in more ways than one. "Dad?" Tommy said, spinning his new basketball on one finger, a trick Jordan had taught him. "I think Mom would have liked today." James pulled out his phone, looking at the old picture of Maria with frosting on her nose. "She would have loved it, buddy." He touched the envelope in his pocket. "And I have a feeling she's got more planned for us." "What do you mean?" James smiled, remembering Jordan's words about the right moment. "Let's just say sometimes the game isn't over when you think it is. Sometimes it's just the end of the first quarter." Tommy nodded sagely, in that way he had that made him seem older than his years. Like when Mom used to say that tough times are just timeouts in the game of life. Exactly like that. James put his arm around his son's shoulders. "Now, what do you say we go get some real lunch? I think we've earned it." As they walked to the car, Tommy teaching him the finger spin trick Jordan had showed him, James felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years. Hope. Real, solid hope. As tangible as the envelope in his pocket, and as precious as the smile on his son's face. Sometimes running on empty led you exactly where you needed to be. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it led you to someone who could help you fill your tank with something even more valuable than gas. Possibility. 1 month had passed since that morning at Friendly's gas station. The envelope from Michael Jordan still sat unopened on James's dresser, waiting for the right moment, just as promised. In that month, something had changed in the Martinez household. Something more than just the new basketball in Tommy's hands. Tommy's latest math test sat on the kitchen table, a bright red B+ circled at the top. Mrs. Peterson's note in the row, margin read, "Amazing improvement. Whatever inspired this change, keep it up." "Dad!" Tommy called from the living room. "Kevin and the others are here. Can we go practice?" James smiled, finishing the last of his morning coffee. The apartment parking lot had become an unofficial basketball court every Saturday morning. Tommy's impromptu coaching sessions had grown from 3 kids to 12, each one wearing their own version of basketball dreams. "Comin', buddy." He grabbed his keys, then paused, looking at the envelope. Something about today felt different. Right. Maybe it was the way the morning sun hit the window, or how Tommy's voice carried the same excitement Maria's used to have before a big lesson. "I think it's time," he whispered to Maria's picture on the wall. Her smile seemed to agree. Outside, the kids were already warming up. Kevin, who'd become Tommy's unofficial assistant coach, was leading them through stretches. His mother sat in a lawn chair nearby, just like Maria used to do, cheering every small victory. "Before we start," James called out, "I have something to share with Tommy." The kids gathered around as James pulled out the envelope, slightly worn from being carried and wondered about for a month. Tommy's eyes went wide, recognizing it from that morning with Jordan. "He said to wait for the right moment," James explained. "And watching you these past weeks, teaching, learning, growing, I think this is it." With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope. Inside were 2 things: a check that made his heart stop, and a stack of official-looking papers. As he read them, his vision blurred with tears. "Dad?" Tommy's voice was worried. "Is everything okay?" James looked at his son, this boy who'd carried so much on young shoulders, who'd found a way to turn grief into giving by teaching others. "More than okay, buddy. Mr. Jordan, he bought the old youth center on Oak Street." The kids gasped. Everyone knew the building. Once a thriving basketball program, now shuttered and empty for years. "But that's not all," James continued. his voice thick with emotion. He's renamed it. It's going to be called the Maria Martinez Youth Basketball Academy. Tommy's new basketball fell from his hands, bouncing unnoticed on the pavement. Mom's name? James nodded, reading from Jordan's letter tucked inside the envelope. Some gifts are about more than money. Your son has talent. Let's make sure he has the chance you never did. The check was for $50,000, enough to cover bills, car repairs, and give them breathing room for the first time in years. But the real gift was in the papers that followed. James was being offered the position of program director at the academy. His warehouse days were over. "There's more," James said, kneeling down to Tommy's level. "Mr. Jordan says you've already proven yourself as a coach. He wants you to help design the youth program, to teach other kids the way your mom taught you." Tommy's eyes filled with tears, but his smile was pure Maria. She always said everyone deserves a chance to play. The other kids erupted in cheers. Kevin hugged Tommy, both boys jumping with excitement. Parents who'd gathered to watch began making plans, offering to help clean up the old building, organize fundraisers, spread the word. James watched it all, remembering Jordan's words about comebacks and second chances, about how sometimes the biggest assists in life don't happen on the court. 3 weeks later, the Maria Martinez Youth Basketball Academy opened its doors. The old building had been transformed, its walls freshly painted in Bulls red and white. A large photo of Maria hung in the entrance, her smile welcoming every child who walked in. Tommy stood at center court, wearing a new Bulls jersey, a gift from Jordan, with Coach Martinez Jr. printed on the back. 20 kids faced him, each holding a basketball, ready for their first lesson. "Remember what my mom used to say," Tommy began, his voice clear and confident. "The rim is giving you a high five, and every shot is a chance to make someone proud." James watched from the doorway, his coach's whistle hanging proudly around his neck. The empty gas gauge that had led them to that fateful morning was now just a memory. Their tank was full, not just with fuel, but with purpose. On the wall behind him, Maria's photos seemed to glow in the morning light streaming through the windows. Her smile held a secret only James could read. Sometimes the biggest victories come disguised as empty tanks and hard times. Sometimes they come in plain white envelopes at gas stations, delivered by legends who understand that the game of life, like basketball, is about more than just keeping score. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they come in the form of second chances, chances to honor those we've lost by helping others find their way. Tommy's voice echoed through the gym. "Okay, everyone, let's start with the basics. Elbows in, follow through, and remember, every shot counts, just like every person counts." James touched the whistle around his neck, then looked up at Maria's photo. "Are you seeing this, honey?" he whispered. "Are you seeing our boy?" The morning sun caught the tears in his eyes, turning them into tiny prisms of light that danced across the court like stars. And somewhere, in that light, he could almost hear Maria's answer, "I never stopped watching, and I never will." The sound of bouncing basketballs filled the air, each one a heartbeat, each one a promise kept. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. And there you have it, friends. The story of how an empty gas tank led to a full heart. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. If it touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button. Sometimes, the biggest miracles really do happen at the most unexpected places. Just like at Friendly's gas station. Until next time, remember what Tommy would say, every shot counts, just like every person counts. Take care.